Welcome back to another episode of our Google Analytics Fundamental series. This week, we're going to talk about how to track events using Google Tag Manager onto your Google Analytics account. We're not only going to show you a step-by-step guide on how to make this happen and the configuration you need to make both on Google Analytics and on Google Tag Manager, we're also going to share with you some of the theoretical framework and theoretical background behind event tracking on your website. We're going to cover topics such as document object model, CSS Selector, and JavaScript to show you how these modern web technology combine together to provide you with the possibility of tracking events using Google Tag Manager in the first place. Why is this helpful? If I'm just showing you how to set up step by step one single event tracking, that's the only thing you're going to know. But understanding how this entire framework works will help you set up all sorts of event tracking tailored to the specific need of your organization without me making another video to show you how to do it otherwise. So I hope that this in-depth overview can give you not only a way to finding fish, but also teaching you fishing by itself, which makes your analytic capability much stronger at your organization than any other video can provide. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, let's begin by talking about what an event is in the first place, how is it different from a page view on your website. The way I like to think about it is if an activity, a user behavior on a website requires a reloading of the page, then it is a page view. If it doesn't, it's an event. Let me illustrate. So for example, this is a website for Google Merchandise Store. If I hover over apparel and click on men's t-shirt, it leads me to a different page entirely. And this is considered a page view because the page is already loaded. But if I click on one of the product picture here, it flips the cart, changes the website somehow without having to reload the page. And we call this an event because something did happen, something changed, but Google Analytics, without additional setup, cannot keep track of this change and do not know this change took place. So we need to set up special tracking today to make these actions recordable by Google Analytics. So how is recording this action possible in the first place? And what is the theory behind recording these actions? How do these actions work? Let's begin by covering a little bit, just going a little bit in depth about the structure of how your website is being rendered. This graphic, which taken from a blog post from Mozilla Hack, illustrated very accurately. So when you're talking about a website, there are three core elements of it. One is the HTML, which defines the structure of your website, where's the navigation, what is a division, what is a table, where is a table, where is a picture, which one follows what. All those are defined by HTML. And your browser reads the HTML of the website and render them into something called a DOM, or document object model, which is a hierarchical structure of your website that describe where everything is. Let me illustrate. So you actually can see the DOM for your website by clicking on Inspect in Google Chrome console, and you see that there is a structure. Every single element for your website have a structure to it. So there's a division, going into a division, going to another division, and going into a form, and then going into several inputs. You can further inspect which element has which model by clicking on the element inspect tool. For example, if you click here, you can see the DOM structure for this, which is H5 going down further down here. This tool is going to be very helpful as we are figuring out our CSS selector in the next step. Going back to the overall structure. When we're talking about HTML, HTML does not define any styling. So if you are just having a website with HTML, it doesn't have any color, it doesn't have any font. It literally is just a plain text that's very boring. That's why we introduced the concept of cascaded style sheet, or CSS, into the mix, which define different styles on your website and how things should look. So for example, CSS might define all the span with this specific ID or with this class decimal will look like this. Will look like blue with this specific font with this specific font size. All those are defined via the cascaded style sheet or CSS structure. However, if you only have HTML and CSS on your website, the website is what we call a static website. It cannot do things like having a pop-up window or having like hover over, fancy hoverovers like this, or having the cart click structure, which it shows you. All these are accomplished by JavaScript. What JavaScript do, as illustrated in this picture, is that it runs few scripts that goes into the DOM structure and the CSS structure of your website, and it dynamically modify them based on various user behaviors. So how this specific card worked is there will be an event listener here on this card that when you click it, it triggers a JavaScript code that defines the flipping of the card, and then it also makes all the text here, all the structure here visible. So JavaScript is a culprit, as we have seen, for almost all events that we are tracking today. And that's why almost all event tracking snippets that you place on your website, Google Tag Manager included, uses JavaScript. Because every time an event happens, it is possible, if you're tracking it, for the Google Tag Manager code to record it and then send it to Google Tag Manager and send it to various different platforms. But those need to be configured manually. So in order to track different elements on our websites, for example, if I want to track this view product click, or if I want to track just overall clicking of a card here, I need to first identify what I want to track in the first place. So for example, if I want to track specifically the clicking of this rainbow shirt over here, I need to be able to identify, tell somehow Google Tag Manager, this is the specific element that I want to track a click on. And the way we do it is through something called a CSS selector. Even though CSS selector is called a CSS selector, it's actually not very much related to the CSS language by itself. Instead, it is more so a method for you to identify HTML elements on your website so you can do a CSS styling on it. An overview for CSS selector can be found on W3 School, which is a very good resource for all web development related stuff. But essentially, the syntax for CSS selector is essentially a long form of a string that contains various information about a specific DOM structure. So for example, if I want to identify this specific element, I can select here, and Google Chrome can also already tell me, okay, so this is an image with ID of JS item listing of that specific ID, and it's within the class of image responsive. So a hashtag mark means the ID of this specific DOM element is defined as that, and the dot represent the class of that specific DOM tag. We will use more illustrative examples during our illustration phase to show you how to specifically use CSS Selector. But right now, let's move on and actually talk about how we can set up event tracking on our website with all these knowledge combined. To set up event tracking on our website, let's go to Google Tag Manager. In order to use Google Tag Manager, let's review several key concepts here. A trigger defines the user behavior on our website. So these are the representation of the events that we want to track on our website. And tags are ways that we send these triggers to different analytics platforms like Google Analytics. So the game plan for today is we're going to the Humanlytics website, and we want to set up tracking for two specific buttons/events. One, we want to be able to track the beta test our platform button in the middle of our website. And then we want to track the submission of this beta testing email list down here. We're going to use two different methods to do this. For beta testing our platform, we're going to use something called a click element. So essentially, we want the trigger to trigger when user click on this specific button and record that as an event and send it to Google Analytics. Whereas for the form submission, we want to use something called the DOM visibility trigger. So there will be, let me just illustrate and show you here. If I submit information here on sign up now, I will see a new line of text. A previously hidden DOM element now is visible. So we can use this instance as a trigger that our form submission is working. So let me show you how to do that. So what you go into the trigger for your Google Tag Manager, and then you click new trigger. So we're going to call this beta testing button trigger. Go to tag trigger configuration, and we want to go to click all elements, and then go to some clicks. And we want the click element to match the CSS selector of this specific button here. And the way we do that is we go to the selection button here, and then we hover over this specific element. It highlights this element, and it also shows us a preliminary version of the CSS selector for this specific element that have a potential of working. The problem for the CSS selector here is the ID for this specific element that is the parent of it is actually dynamic because we're using HubSpot. And HubSpot, for every single unique user, have a different ID for this element. So we need to create basically a custom CSS selector for this specific button, and we're going to show you how to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to console, and we want to essentially use a command to be able to test whether our CSS selector is working. So the command is document query selector all, and then we enter our CSS selector here. What this specific command do in our Chrome console is that it selects every single element on the website that matches the certain CSS selector. And the result we want to achieve is we want the entire query to return one response, and that is this specific button. Because if it returns 0 response, it means our CSS selector is not working. If it returns more than 1, then the CSS selector is not unique. And that's not good because a trigger of another button might trigger also this event, which is not intended for the purpose of this exercise. To identify the CSS selector for this specific button, let's look through the structure with more detail. So we see that at the end, it's an A tag with target being blank and a reference to the specific web URL. Okay, so we might be able to use this specific element. Let's see how we are going to incorporate this element into our CSS selector by referencing the CSS selector reference. So everything that happens here are called an attribute for HTML tag. So we see that in order to identify attribute, we can use the big bracket here. Okay. So we're going to do an A tag with href equals to here. Just copy paste the entire thing. This, and we close the bracket. All right, so now let's see if this is working. If this is the only A tag that contains this reference. We click it here, and we see a list of 6, which means that there are so many other buttons on this website that have the similar attribute. So we need to be a lot more specific in defining our CSS selector here. So let's define its parents as well. So the way we are defining its parents is essentially look up and we see that there is a p tag on the top of this a higher hierarchy of this a tag. So we're going to place a p tag and a space here, which shows that this a tag is underneath the p tag. And we're also going to do a div tag here because above the p tag, there's a div tag. So let's see if this is working. You see, we still see a list of 2, which means it's still not working. So we need to still be a little bit more specific. So let's define the characteristics of the p tag and the d tag here, and the division tag here. So we see the division tag have a class of disk wrapper. And the p tag, we can do it here, have a style of white space pre-wrap. And the a tag have the attribute of the href of this specific URL. All right, let's click here. And we see that only one unique element is selected, and that is the element that we want, which means that this CSS selector is working for this specific button. So let's go back to Google Tag Manager, place it in here, and click Save. And that will be the CSS selector that's working, that defines the triggering of this specific button. Then let's identify this specific element that shows up after submission of the platform and do the same thing for this specific text. So what we're going to do is pretty much the same. So I'm just going to be in silence and do exactly what we did without doing much explanation. So we see that this is a strong tag. So we're looking for a strong tag. And we see it's underneath a P. There's no class, and underneath a div of form submission text. You see that Chrome have the feature of already showing you how many are showing up. So we just need to keep going until we narrow it all down. We see that underneath the div tag is a form tag with attribute with a class of newsletter form. Which is under another div tag of newsletter form wrapper. 0. Oh, div misspelled. Great. So now there's only one element here. Now we select this CSS selector query. And what we need to do is create another trigger here. So we click New. Let's name this trigger form submission visibility trigger. And then we select element visibility in user engagement. And we use CSS selector. We put the element selector in here. We want to trigger once per page because for submission, they can only submit it once per page before loading. So once per page makes sense here. We can ignore advanced. Feel free to read more and ask me any questions, but we're going to skip it for the purpose of this. And then click Save. So now we have both triggers set. It's time to create a tags. So you go into a tag. So we want to create 2 tags. One tag for beta testing button submission, beta testing button click. And we want to configure it with Google Analytics, Universal Analytics. And we click event. And then we need to fill the event tracking parameter. To be honest, there's no standard way of filling this out. you need to define your own standard for your organization. The way I think about it is action will be click, category will be beta testing, and label will be more specific, such as banner button. All right, and then define our Google Analytics setting variable as we did previously. All right, so now let's talk about non-interaction hit. In most cases, we want to set this as false. But in some cases, for example, if you're tracking the first pop-up window that users see on your website that prompts them to sign up for a newsletter or accepting term of services, any button like that, you want to set this option as true, because if a user perform these actions and they leave the website immediately, you still want to consider that session as a bounce session. And if you set this as a false, performing those hits at the beginning of their visit will make these sessions a non-bounce session, which means that your bounce rate will be a lot lower than it should be, and you won't get real insight on how engaged people are with the messaging and the landing page of your website. All right, so with this option all set, let's now go to set up a second trigger, a second tag for this website that describes the submission of that specific button. So I want to click new. We want to call this form submission bottom of page tag. And then we go to tag configuration. Same thing for event tag. For category, I still want it to be beta testing, so it show up at the same time. And action, I want to actually be form submission. Label, we'll just call it bottom of page form. So once again, it's false on a non-interaction hit, setting up a Google Analytics setting. And then we want to trigger as a form submission trigger. Click save. All right, now we have everything configured. It's time to set up and see if these tags we just created are actually collecting data on our website. To do that, as a reminder, we go into the preview mode for Google Tag Manager. Now we go into our website. You might need to reload your website for this Google Tag Manager module to appear. But overall, what we're trying to do here is to perform two very simple actions: clicking on this button and clicking on this button to see whether the two new tags we just configured are working in terms of tracking those two buttons. So let's begin by clicking on this button. We don't need to worry about the page that pops up because it's an external page. Google Analytics cannot track it. So we come back here and we see which tag have fired. We see that the beta testing button click it has fired on the fifth action, which is the action we just took, which means that this is working. And now let's submit a form on the beta testing list. Click here. And let's go to action number 8, which is the action we just took. And we see that form submission bottom page, this tag we just set up, is also working, which means that the two events we just configured are both sending data to Google Analytics as intended. And you can see more details of what specific data are being sent to Google Analytics by clicking on the tag and click show more. And you will see that all the different Google Analytics settings like tracking ID, like actions and labels are all displayed here. When you're done, don't forget to click submit so your change is published. I'm not going to publish here because we already have these buttons tracked on our website. We're just using this for illustration. So that's it. Now your events should be tracked and firing to Google Analytics. It sounds simple, right? It doesn't need any coding as it previously needed. That's why Google Tag Manager is such a wonderful tool to help you do event tracking. Next time on this video, we're going to move away from Google Tag Manager and move into Google Analytics to show you how to read some of the basic report in Google Analytics and understand
your basic customer journey from these reports. So I will see you guys next time.